in the last one. The last one was more aimed at sort of an introduction, so there was bits in there for people at foundation level and there was bits in there for people at intermediate level. This is a bit more intermediate-ish. So if you are at foundation level and you're listening to this lot and trying to understand it and cope with it, I'm not expecting you to understand all of it, just at least you've been exposed to it, you've seen it, and some things do get mentioned in the exam. But that's all they do, they get mentioned in the foundation exam. You're supposed to have a vague idea what they are and that's it. You don't need to know how it works, how you use it, what it does. So there's still a little bit in it for everybody, but hopefully it might drop a few blocks into place in people's thinking. So we'll have a go anyway. Probably the most complex one I've put together, this, so we'll see how it goes. If I see large numbers of people falling asleep, we'll just knock it on the head. So let's recap last time. That's the opening slide from last time. So just sending RF to the other end is completely pointless. We need to impose some information on it, otherwise it's a useless exercise. Just makes your electricity meter go round and round very quickly and achieves nothing. So modulation was the process of applying some sort of information onto that transmitted RF signal so we can send information to the other end. And obviously at the other end you've got to demodulate it so you can get your message back, be it audio, be it Morse, be it some sort of digital code, whatever it is. And we looked at all the different forms of modulation last week. We looked at FM, we looked at AM, we looked at sideband, we looked at various different things and how they all relate to one another. So if you weren't here and you missed all that, sorry, I'm going to chuck you back in at the deep end from here. So just to recap then, let's go back to where we were. AM, we looked at that, and that was the diagram we looked at where you've got the audio signal at the top, or your message on the top line. You've got your carrier, which of course we discussed. It doesn't actually carry anything, because as we saw with single sideband, you can actually get rid of the carrier and still transmit the information. So if that's making your brain twist into knots, you ought to have been here last time. But we can go over it again if you want. And then the amplitude modulated signal at the bottom, so we're varying the intensity or amplitude or size of the carrier wave in sympathy with the audio waveform, so we're transmitting the audio using the RF. But the whole point, the reason I'm putting that back up there, is that we looked at modulation, and you may or may not have picked up some hints in the last talk that we did about modulation. But what we're actually doing when we're modulating something is we're mixing two frequencies. We're mixing this very high frequency RF signal with a very low frequency audio signal, and the result of that mixing process is the modulated waveform. So modulation is actually mixing. All forms of modulation are, in essence, mixing. We're mixing two things. We're mixing an RF signal and an audio signal or a digital signal or whatever, and the result is something different. So mixing, keep that in mind. That's what's going on, and that's what we're going to look at tonight, is more on this mixing side and try and see where that leads us, how deep the rabbit hole goes. Let's go back to remembering about the frequency spectrum. So you remember that left-hand diagram there, when we talked about AM, we said that if we modulate our carrier with, say, a 1 kilohertz pure audio tone, what you will see on a frequency display is your carrier signal in the center, and 1 kilohertz away, you'll see an upper sideband. 1 kilohertz below it, you'll see another sideband, and that 1 kilohertz is the difference. It's the 1 kilohertz tone that you're modulating it with. So what you're actually getting there is the carrier frequency FC, and you're mixing it with your audio tone, and you're getting a result. You're getting the carrier frequency plus whatever the frequency of your audio is, and your carrier frequency minus whatever it is. That applies to anything. if we mixed two RF signals 1 megahertz apart, say 1 megahertz and 2 megahertz, we can do that just as easily as mixing a low-level audio signal. It's still mixing. It's the same principles that apply with the same sort of results, the same sort of outputs, inputs, things to be aware of. So if you think of it in those terms, modulation and mixing aren't really two separate topics. They're one and the same thing. And that is a key to understanding some of the stuff that's going on. We saw there in our diagram of the two sidebands, instead of modulating with a single pure tone, we're actually modulating with a whole range of audio frequencies there. Noise, music, yeah? What?
Could it be Morse?
Could be Morse.
Because I was thinking, like continuous wave or carrier wave, it's got a more narrow band on sideband, which
Correct.
means it could be much more successful at times with the actual sideband itself.
Yeah.
I think Morse is a good idea. I never understand why they scrapped it in this country. States did the same thing.
Well,
Great shame, but
we still all use it. Yeah. The whole point there is you've got your 1 kilohertz tone, you've got like 10 kilohertz, you've got 300 hertz, whatever you've got in your audio spectrum there, because there's all sorts of different frequencies coming and going in a voice or a passage of music, you basically see a whole sideband of frequencies. But again, it's the same thing. It's the carrier plus or minus whatever's happening at any particular instant in time. That's why you see a sideband. Usually, as it says there, 300 hertz to 4000 hertz. That's very wide. That's broadcast quality. Normally, we want 300 hertz to about 3.5 kilohertz. That's the key frequencies for intelligibility of the human voice. That's all we need to transmit. Why use up more bandwidth when it's not really getting you anything extra at the other end? For our purposes anyway. So we looked at that. That's the AM frequency spectrum. We looked at FM. And again, we saw there how you get a whole range of sidebands generated on FM. But it's the same thing. The fact that you're seeing these sidebands and the fact that you're seeing it there on a frequency plot, the way it spreads out, is showing you again that what's happening here is the mixing of the two frequencies. And what you're seeing is the result of that mixing. So just to recap that, so we've got that in our heads. Mixing of the carrier, the RF frequency, with whatever audio or digital signal you're putting in is going to generate the carrier plus that and the carrier minus that, and probably other artifacts as well, as we're going to see. Yeah? Good so far? Right, we're in the realm of mixing. We've moved on from modulation. Now then, let's jump off into three sort of aside thoughts, which are going to help us then. We're going to look at three different things that are sort of allied to this, but a little bit of a diversion. And then hopefully by a massive puff of logic at the end, we're going to bring them all together. And everybody's going to go, aha, great. We'll see. That might not happen. Number one, harmonics. We all know about harmonics. You hear them every day, I can guarantee it. In musical terms, a pure sine wave, just a pure 500 hertz tone or whatever, is a very boring sound. What actually gives colour and presence to music and speech is all the harmonic content in it. People like Stradivarius made vast amounts of money because he was able to make his violins and instruments in such a way that the harmonic content and the resonances that came out of that wood were like nothing else. Nobody else could do it. And that's what makes the difference. If you look at audio, you'll see all kinds of harmonics and products of harmonics in there. And what a harmonic basically is multiples of the original signal. So if you've got a 1 kilohertz audio tone, then there'll be a harmonic of that, double it, 2 kilohertz. Double that, 3. It's 3 times the 1 kilohertz, 4, 5, 6, etc. Same in RF. If you've got a 1 megahertz RF signal, the second harmonic of that will be 2 megahertz, and then 3 megahertz. So harmonics are related to the original. The original signal is called the fundamental. That will come up on the exam sometimes. Yeah, fundamental. In the RF world, we may not want harmonics. Because if you think about it, if you're supposed to be transmitting at 3.5 megahertz on the 80 meter band, and you're also radiating the second harmonic, you're also radiating lots of energy on 7 megahertz. And you'll be there going CQ80, CQ80, and people on 40 will be going, what's this guy coming out on this band? He's in the wrong place. Yeah. And
More than the wrong place. It's harmonic. It's more than the wrong place, I'll tell you.
It could be even worse, because if you're on the 50 megahertz band, your second harmonic could be in the middle of the air band, and you're going to find PC Plod banging on your door, shutting you down. So radiating harmonics in our world is never a good idea. But we might also want to actually generate harmonics, because they can be very useful. Well, that's about 8 of my slides gone there, so we'll come to that in a minute. So that was harmonics. Anchor that in your head, because that's, as we said, friend or foe, both. We'll find out later. But in exam purposes, recognise that harmonics can be bad, because you can be transmitting on bands you're not supposed to, because you're generating harmonics of your transmission. That's bad. Can be useful.
Anybody who's using this kind of equipment should be able to check for harmonics anyway.
They should do, but the foundation exam doesn't really ask you to know how to do it.
Foundation says you must
just
check your equipment from time to time.
Yeah.
At no point does it tell you how to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you're supposed to.
Yeah, still there.
Yeah. They just expect you to know that there's a potential problem, not how to fix it.
Or how to identify.
Or how to identify it.
That's shit, right?
So, aside number 2 then. Here's another one. Fourier analysis. Anybody ever been to uni and done this? Yeah. There's always one person. The technical description of it there, you can imagine some sort of bloke with white hair and a lab coat reading this out. It's a method that transforms a data-time series into the frequency domain to determine which frequency content is within the data-time series. Another way of saying that is it's some maths that you can do, and you can take basically a waveform, you can do this maths on it, and the output of that maths will tell you what frequencies are contained within that waveform. So it's, instead of looking at it in time terms, like the voltage is going up and down as time progresses in a sine wave or whatever, we're looking at it in frequency terms, such as like, what's the fundamental frequency? Are there any harmonics in there? Are there any other frequencies mixed in with it that we should know about? You can take the waveform, stuff it into this thing, and out comes those answers. People at uni probably spend about a fortnight being worked through this, and by the time you've managed just to stagger to the end of working out one example, they then tell you, oh, you'll never need to do that again, we'll get a computer to do that, or we'll get a piece of equipment to do that. But they just want you to do it so you understand how it works. What does that mean? Well, if you've ever looked at a spectrum analyzer or any kind of display there, you'll recognise what that view on the right looks like. And all this diagram is trying to say is, there's a complex looking waveform on that side, and we're reflecting it into the frequency domain and analysing and saying, oh look, that is actually made up of 2 different frequencies. And that's the amount of the first one that's in there, and that's the amount of the second one that's in there. So that's what this technique can do. Again, the foundation license book mentions it. Don't really tell you what it is, don't really explain it properly, but it mentions it. So I think you're just supposed to have, oh, I've heard of that, yeah, and I know roughly what it does. That's as far as you need to go for foundation. But basically, this is what a spectrum analyzer or a nano VNA, any of those pieces of equipment, that's what it's doing under the hood. Why am I telling you this? Because this relates to what we've been talking about. If you look at some of these waves here, look at the most interesting one is the square wave one at the top. If you do a Fourier analysis on a square wave, you'll find out that it's full of harmonics. It's a fundamental signal plus the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth harmonic going down in terms of size, and eventually if you keep adding those on top of one another, you'll come out with a square. Yeah?
Lots of signals do similar, and I was going to come out with this, but I didn't know when to come out with it. When we generate signals, can't be a bad thing, can it?
No. So the reason I'm showing you that is that the harmonic content basically of these different waveforms. So you look at a complex wave, remember that waveform that we looked at for AM? That weird looking waveform going up and down like that? Well, if we reversed that and analysed it, we'd be able to see that it contains the RF signal and a very low level audio signal. That would come out of this technique and show us that. There's various other ones there. It's showing you that you can analyse and see the different harmonics and stuff that are in there. Go back to the square wave example. As I said, you find out with the square wave that it's made up of these different, that's the fundamental, that's what it looks like if you add the second harmonic on as well. This is what it looks like if you add the third harmonic on as well. So you can see it's beginning to approach a square wave already, a bit ripply. And remember we talked about key clicks for Morse? Well, this is why key clicks are bad, because those sharp rising and falling edges, if you look at this technique, it contains an awful lot of harmonic content, and your transmitter is going to be radiating that along with the frequency that you want to transmit on, which is why it can cause interference. Amplifier. Foundation licenses, all right, you can only have your 25 watts, but full licenses, we can have 1,000 watts. And we're not going to get there without a linear amplifier, because most transceivers only do 100. So, but the whole point about a linear amplifier is that if you amplify something with a linear amplifier, you're going to get out exactly what you put in, only bigger. You're not going to get any distortion, you're not going to get any intermodulation products, you're not going to get, yes?
It's worth noting that
Linear. You only get out what you put in. It doesn't add any distortion, it doesn't add any products, which is a good thing, because if you're transmitting on a particular frequency, you don't want to be transmitting anywhere else. All you want out of your linear amplifier is what you put into it. A non-linear system or amplifier will add distortion, harmonics, whatever. That's even true with audio stuff. You know, you get distortion on audio stuff. And if you analyse it, what you're seeing is the non-linear amplifier actually adding its own products and stuff in there. So distortion is actually extra frequencies. They're not in the original input that you're putting in. They're being generated inside the amplifier or the circuit itself. So you may be getting harmonics, you may be getting mixing products in there. So we might actually want a non-linear amplifier because we might want to do mixing. Remember, modulation is mixing. Penny's dropping here. So modulation is a non-linear kind of thing because we actually want to mix two things together. We might use it for a mixer, we might use it for a multiplier, which we're going to look at, we might use it for a modulator. So sometimes we really do want a linear amplifier, other times we're actually happy it's not linear because it helps us to do things like this. So let's look at mixing. Remember the modulation stuff we looked at. If we add two frequencies, we get F1 plus F2 and we get F1 minus F2. That's no rocket science there. We looked at that. We're comfortable with that. We understand that. But at a lower level, we're also going to get all this other stuff coming out. We're going to get harmonics, double F1, the second harmonic of F1. We're going to get 3 times F1. We're going to get double F2. We're going to get 3 times F2. Because this thing is non-linear. Anything it can produce, it's going to produce. At a lower level, obviously. If you were to look at this on the spectrum display, you'd see like the fundamental 2 frequencies you're mixing are there. The result is there, but then you've got all this lower level stuff as well coming out. You can get the intermodulation products, so you can get that second harmonic of F1 mixing with F2, creating something different again. So you can get a whole comb of stuff coming out of this device. Here's an example here. If we have 2 original signals, we've got 1 megahertz and 3/4 of a megahertz. F1 minus F2, we're going to get something coming out at 1/4 of a megahertz there, 0.25. We're also going to get the sum, we're going to get a signal out at 1.75. They weren't there before. So if what we actually wanted to do was generate a signal at 1.75 megahertz, and we don't have a way of doing it, we could use a mixer to mix those two and produce that. And then if we can find some way of isolating that and taking it out, we can do something with it. And you'll find out a lot of transmitters and receivers use that kind of technique, mixing of two frequencies. You think of your VFO, you think of channels, your crystals and stuff like that, which was mentioned earlier. We're going to look at it in a minute. But this is a technique, this is how a lot of stuff works. And it's relying on this non-linearity, mixing. Obviously, with all of that vomit coming out that's on the left-hand side, the one thing you want after a mixer is a filter. You want to produce all this crud, and then you want to filter out the one that you actually want and eliminate all the others, because you do not want to be radiating them. You don't want to be having to deal with them in your circuit. Let's look at another possibility then. We mentioned that you're going to get the harmonics generated. Well, how about we use it for a frequency doubler then? We make an amplifier non-linear. Let's stuff 1 megahertz into that transistor there that doesn't basically have any bias. So it's definitely not going to be behaving itself. It's not going to be a very nice amplifier. But in terms of a non-linear system, it's going to be great. So if we bung 1 megahertz into its base and we have a tuned circuit in its collector tuned to 2 megahertz, we'll be able to pick up that second harmonic that's being generated and take it out. We put 1 megahertz in, we get 2 out. We've just built a frequency doubler. You can also do that by tuning this differently, and you can get a tripler. The most I've ever seen done is ×4. That's getting a bit hairy. But tripling, that's fairly common. The old Pi radio telephone taxi ones that amateurs used to modify back in the day, when that was all that was available. They used to have a crystal chain, just the way the gentleman said earlier. Start off with a low frequency crystal, double it, triple it, double it again, and produce a final output. And that's the way it's done. It's actually dead simple. So, mixing to create a new frequency, frequency doubling or tripling, that's another use of this, all to do with mixing. Let's have a look here. This is part of the circuit of a beacon in Norway, and you can see there the way that they're generating the 144 megs output. They've got the first stage down there, 36 megahertz, then they're doubling that, 72 megahertz, they're doubling it again to get 144, and then you've got an extra filter and amplifier in there just to make sure that what's coming out is clean and you're not actually transmitting on 36, 72 and 144 all at the same time, which will be kind of license limiting behaviour. And what they don't show you on there is on the base of that transistor, off the left hand side of the diagram, where it says 36 meg, I bet they haven't got a 36 meg crystal on there. I bet that's a 12 megahertz crystal, and I bet that's tripling. So there you go, tripling and then doubling, 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 and that's a fairly obvious use of it, and you see that a lot, quite a lot. Let's have a look at some mixing example again. Here's a rather bad example. It's the only decent block diagram I could find there. For example, the top one there, putting 400 megahertz in, mixing it with a 500 megahertz oscillator, we can get 900 megahertz out. Notice the filter there, because we don't want to be transmitting on 400 megahertz or any of the other products. We just want the output that we want. You could also reverse that for a receiver. 900 megahertz coming in, we mix that with a local oscillator at 500 megahertz, gives us 400 megahertz coming out, which can then go into an IF chain or a detector or whatever you're doing for it. But this is very, very, very common. Happens a lot.
Is it common at microwave, Alan?
What?
Is it common at microwave?
Yes. Yeah. All frequencies.
So you'd have a mixer band crystal in there, actually do the mixing that you've already got.
Yeah. Well, at microwaves it gets weird. They do it in waveguides, and they have little loops of wire and little diodes soldered to the wall, and so you don't see tuned circuits as such. Stuart?
On an AM radio, you've got the audio coming in on the RF. How do you get then the audio to be superimposed onto the IF frequency and forward it on?
You're talking about coming in from the aerial?
Into the mixer stage, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's modulated, isn't it? That's a modulated signal.
Yes.
All you're doing is translating that modulated signal to a different frequency. but it's still modulated when it gets there. How?
From the RF amplitude to the IF amplitude, how is it that achieved?
Like this. Exactly like that.
That's it.
That's your RF coming in. We mix it with a suitable local oscillator so that the difference between that frequency and that frequency is the IF that we want. And that's how it's done. We're only going to kind of mention that briefly at the end of the talk. That's a whole nother talk, is the superhet architecture and how that actually works, because there's various different issues to do with that. But that's definitely in foundation level sort of territory there. Another example, just to whet your appetite, here's somebody's block diagram of a basic 2-meter transceiver. Now on a transceiver, you quite often see them reusing these oscillators for transmit and receive. Because if you think about it from that previous diagram, what you want to do in one direction, you also want to do in the opposite direction, and the frequencies you want to mix in to achieve that are the same. Well, why have two separate oscillators then? Let's just have one and use it for two different purposes. So on here we can see the generating at 10.7 megahertz, the sideband, putting it through a filter, mixing it with a 133.3 local oscillator, which gives you 144 megs out, and coming back in again, the same result there. IF filter will give us a 10.7 meg IF, detect it, comes out the speaker. So you see things being reused as well, like that. Here's another example. For those of you who sort of now in the days of like, I can just buy a 2-meter rig or even a 70 cents rig or even a 1296, 23 centimeters, you can buy an Icon that does that. Back in the day I started, it was actually really hard to get onto 144 megahertz. It was difficult. You basically had to build your own gear. And the route a lot of people went was the transverter, which you don't really see too much now.
I thought it was a transverter there when I spotted it on a 16 meg clock.
Yeah, no, that was a transceiver. This is a transverter this time.
Yeah, but it said 116. Well, if we mix 116 with 28 megs, what we got there?
Yeah, this is a transverter.
Thought it was, because that clock is still there.
Yeah.
160 meg. What we're basically doing
Correct.
is have the clock speed at 160 meg and mix it up for transmit and mix it down for receive.
Yeah, the whole point of a transverter is
There's nothing to it. It's not.
it allows you to use an HF rig on 28 megs to actually work on the 2-meter band. So it's using frequency mixing to convert the frequency up for transmit and to convert it down for receive. And there we go. This is the same thing, look. There's a local oscillator there, 116 meg, being mixed. A bit of clever use of the same circuitry on transmit. Notice the filters. So again, it's exactly the same thing. You pick suitable local oscillator frequency that when you mix it with your desired frequency will give you what you want. I'm kind of hammering the point here just to make sure that you really understand this. This appears everywhere, and I've given you several examples of where you'll see it. That is the diagram of the venerable Fox Tango 101, probably the most widely known amateur transceiver in the whole of history. The Yaesu FT101 came out in so many different variants. It's an HF rig. You can look at that and go, flipping heck, but...
Is there a roofing filter in there?
No, didn't have one.
I thought I didn't see anything.
We can understand this if we follow it through. Look, there's the aerial on this side. The first thing that's happening here is for all the different bands, we've got a different crystal which they're switching in. And it tells you there what frequency of crystal. There's a blinking moth on the screen.
Yeah. It
tells us what we've got there. So we're mixing a crystal with the RF coming in, and we're producing an IF of 5520 to 6020, depending on where we're tuning in the band. So there's the first set of mixing going on, right there. We've also got a VFO down the bottom here, which is running on 87 to 92. That's being mixed with that to generate another IF here, and then that's being mixed with a set of On receive, they're being used as carrier insertion oscillators on the same frequency to get the audio back, and on transmit, they're being used to actually generate the SSB, which is then going to go back through the chain the other way. So you can actually, if you sit down and you do the maths on these, you think 40 meters, and then look at the 40 meter crystal and get your calculator out, you'll find out that you can make that, and then you'll find out from those frequencies there with this one that it all works out. And that's how they do it. It's pretty simple really, but when you look at it at first you think, don't understand that, but now we do. There's also another nice little thing here, look. Calibrator unit. Back in the days where we didn't have digital displays and you couldn't actually rely on what that knob was telling you, whether you were on frequency or not, they used to put a crystal calibrator in here. But they're actually starting off with a 3.2 meg crystal, and they're dividing it down in a binary counter to get 100 kilohertz signals out of it. And then that appears on your dial, so you can switch that on and you know when you turn that round that, oh, my zero is actually in the right place. So lots and lots and lots of different things here. We mentioned the super het. That was the question there. And it's the same thing again. The super het receiver, you find it everywhere. Almost every radio that you'll find these days works on this principle. And it's the same thing. The RF signal comes in from the aerial. We mix it with a local oscillator to generate an intermediate frequency, a different frequency. Old sets, you'll find they used to use 455 kilohertz for long wave and medium wave sets. Modern sets, FM stuff, 10.7 megahertz is a common IF. I've got an old Eddystone 640 old valve receiver that used to use 1.6 megs as the IF. Don't really matter what you choose, it'll still work, but there's different drawbacks and benefits from using different frequencies depending on what frequency you actually want the receiver to tune. And that's a whole different story, but that's basically how it works. And just to pick up on your point there, what's coming in here is the modulated signal. We're mixing it with that, and what's going through here is still the modulated signal. We've just translated it to a different frequency. So we're keeping the signal, the modulation, all the way through till we demodulate it and then put it out of our speaker. So that's mixing, frequency, harmonics. You can see how it all gets related, and it's actually the same thing as modulation in a way. It all connects together. By the way, you might do a double super het. That's quite common as well. So you have two different IFs, probably a higher one, probably 10.7 megs at the beginning, and then maybe down to 455. Without straying on to why we bother with doing this, you can get a lot of selectivity that way. You can actually put crystal filters in things to make that IF very, very tight. So only what you're going to be listening to is what you're trying to tune in, rather than a receiver that doesn't have that kind of filtering in it, which is going to be wide open and nearby stations are going to be thumping you and you're going to struggle to hear. So there's reasons why this is done, but that's how it's done. And that's as far as I was basically going to try and go tonight with that. So what we haven't talked about is we haven't looked at oscillators or VFOs in detail. Told you about them, you know what they do and roughly how they work and why we have them, but there's a whole new talk to do about why, you know, what you might want from a VFO, how you might build one. You know, is it going to drift? What's going to happen with it exactly? Mixers, we've not looked at the circuitry of mixers, but we can do, yeah. But I've just told you what it does and why it does it. And for foundation level, that's all you really need to know. In fact, we've gone further than you need for foundation tonight. We haven't looked at what you've almost all got, which is frequency synthesizer, where you no longer have to have a variable oscillator with a knob on it. You just type in on a keyboard the frequency you want and magically it comes out. How does it come out? Well, the old way of doing it was the phase locked loop, which we haven't looked at tonight. More modern, direct digital synthesis. You actually use basically a computer processor to generate the frequency you want, filter out all the vomit that comes with it, and then just use that for your radio. we haven't really looked at that. We haven't looked at software-defined radio, which is the same thing wearing a different coat, to be honest. We can do those. We can look at those another time. But the risk of going off the deep end, I think that's enough to take in for one night, personally.
Yeah.
So I hope that was useful. I hope it wasn't too far off the top, but hopefully it kind of, things you'll read, things you'll look at when you're looking at the exam book and it talks about this stuff and it shows you these block diagrams with mixers in, things like that. You probably now go, oh yeah, remember that, get that, and you can move on and build on that and use it for building block to understand something else. So, that's all I've got. I'll put that slide up now. Go on, ask away.